Hello and salamu alaikum. My name is Dr. Michael Mohammed Ahmad. I am the founding director of Sweatshop Literacy Movement and the author of The Lebs. I am also the very proud editor of this brand new anthology called After Australia. And today I will be talking to two of the amazing contributors to After Australia. The first being Noongar writer Claire G. Coleman. Claire, among many other amazing things, is the author of Terra Nullius and The Old Lie. I want to introduce you all to the original gangster of speculative fiction, Claire G. Coleman.
Hey, how you doing?
And I'm also joined today by my brother, Arab-Australian Muslim poet, Omar Sakr. Omar, among many other things, is the author of These Wild Houses and The Lost Arabs. Salam, Omar. How are you?
Assalamu alaikum. I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm very good. In fact, let's start our conversation with that question. How are you? How are you both doing in the current pandemic?
I'm kind of, it hasn't changed my life that much because I'm a full-time writer and I was already working from home. But it would be nice to go out from time to time, and being driven a bit mental by having to do all my book touring and festivals and stuff like that over Zoom, which I'm not a fan of. I'd much rather do it in person. I'd much rather see you guys in person. And hang out in the green room and do all the things that we do at writers' festivals, rather than being in Melbourne under lockdown and not really being able to leave the house. It's terrible.
Look, my first response is always going to be Alhamdulillah. I'm okay. I'm alive. I'm here. So thanks be to God. But it hasn't been easy at the same time. I was just in the country visiting my father-in-law who has cancer, helping him out. Yes, there's been all kinds of issues of dealing with being stuck inside and things like that. And also stuff that I talk about in my story, white flu, talking to family members who frankly don't trust anything any authority figure tells them. We have a deep distrust of them because we have good reason to think that they don't have our best interests at heart. So right now I'm preparing after this panel to go to my brother's house and try to get through to him once again that, this is a real virus and that they need to be careful.
Thank you both. So I think we're going to probably unpack quite a lot of what you already started pointing out in the context of our work. So for those joining us, what I would like to point out is that we are currently celebrating the release of an anthology called After Australia, which speculates and offers alternatives for Australia's past, present, and future. And I'm confident we're going to have quite a rigorous and comprehensive discussion over the next 45 to 50 minutes. I always think it's incredibly important to begin with an acknowledgement of country, and I would like to read the acknowledgement of country featured in the first page of After Australia. So please bear with me for a moment while I read this. We acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we work and on which this book was produced, and we pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. We recognize that sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. We embrace the principle of First Nations first, recentering Australian history with Indigenous histories. We recognize that Australia's migration history began and continues on stolen land that has not been ceded, and that it is untenable to talk about race in Australia without situating it in the histories of dispossession and colonisation of Australia's First Peoples. And of course, for me, that acknowledgement of country leads into the first question. Within the current climate, not just COVID-19, but of course the Black Lives Matter movement, and earlier this year, the bushfires and the crisis, the climate crisis that we're currently facing. I want to ask you both how you feel after Australia plays a role in shaping discussion about the world we're currently living in and the world we're heading towards. And I'll start with our Indigenous sister, Claire, if you want to start that conversation.
Sure. It's it's interesting that over the last couple of days, I saw something in the media. I saw it today. I don't know if it was today or yesterday that it was published. There's a bunch of Australian expats working overseas who are complaining that when they return, they're going to have to pay for their own quarantine. Right? Now, that actually almost sent me into hysterics, because essentially that question of can the privileged in Australia ever be treated like we treat refugees is now actually happening. That's the question I was asking in my story, Ostraca. That's actually happening as we speak. And of course, the privileged people who've gone to be expats and work overseas are whining about not being treated with the privilege of being able to return when they decide to, and getting full rights of return during a pandemic. It just struck me as kind of, it's a bit. We've been speaking before about Omar having been prophetic. Well, it turns out that I have been as well now, because there's people complaining about suddenly they don't have the first world rights they thought they were going to have, of being able to return when they want and having the taxpayer pay for their quarantine. And I would not have a problem with the taxpayer paying for the quarantine, except that many of them have simply chosen to stay at work in another country where they've been part of a process of economic colonisation for their entire working careers in some cases. And it was interesting to me that the article where people were complaining about having to pay for their quarantine, everyone who was complaining was a white person working in another country. There weren't people who were kind of stuck because they had some disaster happening. The people they were interviewing were all expat workers. And I think it's important that, of course, the anthology after Australia does what speculative fiction has always done, which is unpack our present by projecting our current situation into the future. And by doing that, it's enabled us to question what Australia actually is. By looking into after Australia, we get to question the now of Australia.
Thank you, Claire. And we'll come back to more conversations about specifically your piece, Ostraca and the Ostraca Law. But before that, Omar, do you want to weigh in, and maybe specifically, because Claire started to touch on it, do you want to speak specifically about how your particular piece fits into the current climate? And in particular, I would point out that we were predicting, the book was meant to be, imagining versions of reality in the year 2050. Do you want to speak about how unusually timely your piece actually turned out to be?
Sure, but I think I'll start by talking to the first point, which is about the role our art plays more generally. And I think it's important to emphasize how serious the role of an artist is in society. Who gets to tell stories, who gets to get heard, and particularly for me, and I know for many, if not all, of our Black and brown brothers and sisters and kinfolk. We come from crisis, and we use art to talk to and through that crisis, to get us through it and to get our people through it, to force a reckoning. And I think in many respects, this is what we're doing in After Australia. To my piece specifically, yes, it's about a pandemic. It is about a mysterious illness that sweeps the world, which I started writing over a year ago. And the virus quickly becomes racialized. It is affecting white people, predominantly, it seems, or at least that is what the hysterical white reaction is to the virus. And I don't want to focus too much on the idea of its prescience, because for me, I'm just writing about what's been happening for a very long time, which we've seen with SARS, which we've seen with Ebola, which we've seen with Zika, which we've seen with MERS, literally the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, right? All of these viruses which were met with, again, a kind of justified hysteria, were also quickly categorized as belonging to or being the fault of people of color. And so me saying, writing a story where it's flipped and it affects white people, I'm really speaking to our present and our past more than I was trying to say this is going to happen in the future.
Thanks, Omar. So for both of you, what I would say is that the book has been out now for about 6 weeks. It's selling incredibly well. It's a critically acclaimed book. It's very it's being very heavily discussed, which shouldn't be surprising. It's very timely. I wanted to ask you both, so far up to its release, how you feel the reception has been. And I definitely want to hear what Claire has to say about this. But before that, we'll just stay on Omar. In particular, maybe, Omar, you can talk about the public reception so far, both the positive and the negative, towards a short story you wrote called White Flu.
Yeah, I had a very big response to just the first paragraph of the story that I posted on Twitter, somewhat naively thinking this is cool. People will be able to be excited about the story and reading it. And yeah, there was quite a lot of white racist trolls who quickly found it and started having a go at me, and not just on Twitter, but across social media, on 4chan. There's an article about me on something called altright.com, the headline of which is "Deviant Bisexual Muslim Omar Sakr writes a story about white erasure," or something like that. And amongst the responses, there was a lot of threats and violent references to the Christchurch massacre, where a white Australian man murdered 51 Muslims last year, and the implication being that this was good or that it would soon happen to me. And there were more specific threats as well. So that was the negative. There's been many positive responses as well, and in particular for me, what I'm always looking for, and I'm not expecting it, but I'm hoping for it, is that my Arab Muslim queer communities will find it, read it, love it, and speak to me about it, and that's been happening as well. And that's why I write.
That's really great, that second part of your answer, and I want to touch on your complex identity later on. But Claire, I really want to continue this conversation about the reception of the book and your stories. But with you, I want to start in particular, I want to ask you why you think there's been such a strong emotional reaction from members of the white right and people who whether they admit it or not are white supremacists towards the book and towards stories like Omar's.
I think I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I believe it's people have been saying lately that white supremacists believe that anti-racist is anti-whiteness, and that's because someone said that what people who call themselves pro-white are anti-black because they think that people who are pro-black are anti-white. The people from the position of privilege believe that people that we don't want to take away the privilege and even out the playing field so everyone's equal. What they think is that we want to climb over them and push them down below us and take over. They think, and they're terrified of the idea of white erasure when deep down they know that white people have been responsible for attempting to erase other cultures for a long time. The idea of the white flu in Omar's book is what amuses me the most about the reaction, and I'm beginning to find it amusing. At first, I was really feeling sad for Omar being trolled like that, but I had two thoughts about that. Firstly, I think thank the gods it's not me this time, and secondly, it's like, well, they're scared of being erased by the idea of a white flu. But when the British first came to Australia, the smallpox was used as a tool of colonisation. They intentionally used a disease in various places they colonised. When they knew people did not have immunity to this disease, they sent the disease out as a forerunner for their colonial forces. In the United States, they intentionally infected people. In Australia, people were they weren't trying to stop sick people from going out and interacting with Aboriginal people. And there's stories from Polynesia that Cook intentionally allowed the syphilitic men to go out and sleep with native women in Polynesia. So there's all these things where in a way, plagues have been racialized since the days of colonization, but it's never been against white people. It's always been against other people. The only time where whiteness has been negatively affected by diseases has been the lack of resistance to malaria, which possibly kept them out of the north of Australia for a bit longer than the rest of Australia. And that's kind of it. The rest of the time, diseases were used to wipe us out, not wipe them out.
Why then, let me ask you, why is it that a fictional story that an Arab Muslim poet writes about a flu that specifically targets or affects white people is more offensive to white people than the reality of something like, say, the Christchurch massacre, which took place last year, where a white supremacist killed 51 Muslims, or the reality that the original white colonizers of this country used literal diseases to try to wipe out actual people of color, Indigenous people. Why do you think white people are more offended about the fiction than the reality?
I think it's because the fiction is fictionally attacking them. And they don't mind when other people are harmed by reality, but they are concerned that it'll come back on them one day. I think, and also there's if you're in the darker, more horrific parts of the internet, there are movements that believe, or either say they believe, or genuinely believe that the world is out there. Some mysterious globalized forces out there are attempting to make white people extinct. They actually, you see this all the time on the internet, people who believe that there's a movement to make them extinct. And I think they fear they're going to be treated like they've treated other people. I can't remember who said it first, but it's been said a lot lately, which is about feminism. People saying that men don't fear that women want equality, they fear that women want revenge. Well, the white people of the world don't fear that the people they colonized want to decolonize. They fear that we want to colonize them. Mm. And I think that's what it comes down to.
I do kind of want to eradicate whiteness.
Well, I want to start talking about.
Can I just say that?
Ostraca. I want to talk about Ostraca in a moment, but I just want to give Omar a chance to elaborate on that. Omar, the same question that I was asking Claire, why do you think your fictional story has caused such offense? And why do you think it's more offensive than the current reality, including the way COVID is actually unfairly discriminating in the way it's kind of playing out and affecting people of color and Indigenous people more than white people?
It's not more offensive. Why are these people responding the way that they do? I think right up front we have to just say they will take any opportunity to troll us, to have a go at us, to be there is at the very most basic level, it's just racist. It's just and it's also an inability to read us. To recognize irony and satire. We're always read in the most literal way. And yeah, as well as that, though, I think there's an awareness that stories have power. They're always saying otherwise, right? They're always trying to say, oh, no, we don't need to have, Indigenous-led movies, or we don't need to have people of color as superheroes or whatever. Stories don't matter, blah, 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 all that kind of shit. But they put so much effort into trying to ensure that we don't get those stories, right? That there is an inequality and an erasure, an ongoing erasure, funnily enough, of our voices, our histories, and our imaginings. So I think that's also at play when they read our work. It's a fear of what will happen if we get to tell stories.
What I would say to both of you and to our audience is, for me as an Arab Australian Muslim writer, I always pride myself on offending white supremacists and racists. I feel like if that's what I'm doing, if that's what my work is doing, it's a good sign that I'm doing the right thing. Claire, I want to move on to your story, and I want to start this conversation by asking you, what is the Ostraca Law? Sure.
In Australia and the United States and Britain, we like to think of ourselves as having a democracy that continues back as far as ancient Athens, the place of the scholars and the intellectuals. And Athenian democracy was never democracy as we know it. Only the pretty much landed wealthy men had the vote, and every decision that was made, they'd vote on. It wasn't like our representative democracy, which has nothing to do with the foundation of democracy at all. But one thing we've definitely forgotten the existence of is a law called, a thing called Ostraca in ancient Athens, where at the entrance to the forum, there was an urn you could drop in a piece of ceramics with someone's name written on it. And if there's enough of them that for the same name, that person would be exiled from the city for like 10 years and lose their citizenship and become essentially stateless. And so the ability to render someone stateless is in the foundation of what democracy is. And that was called the Ostraca, or the Ostraca. It basically means a shard of pottery. And in my short story, I imagined what if we returned to the law of rendering people stateless, and what that could mean. Because in Australia tried to render someone stateless. There was a Fijian Australian Australian government tried to render stateless. I can't remember what his name was, but he was tried under terrorism laws. And rather than dealing with it, they made an attempt to remove his Australian citizenship, which was stopped by the United Nations because he didn't have dual citizenship. Therefore, he'd be rendered stateless, which is illegal under our law. And, of course, in Australia, we've been rendering people stateless for a long time anyway, which is refugees coming to the country without papers are rendered stateless because they're stateless because they're not really welcome back where they came from, but we won't accept them into here. We put them on Manus Island and leave them there indefinitely as stateless people anyway. So what I imagined is, what if the government bring in a law to enable them to render people of bad character stateless, and what that would mean, and how a law if that's based purely on the idea of good character, could be abused. So someone could be rendered of bad character for something very minor if you wanted to remove them from the country. And so Ostraca is an interesting, powerful concept in stories, because we never imagine being able to have the citizenship of the country we were born in removed. But there's nothing except international law that stops that from happening.
One of the aspects of your story, which is very striking, is the very strong sense of incarceration and the very strong sense that the characters are imprisoned. And I for you as a Black writer, as an Indigenous woman, writing in the current Black Lives Matter moment, I wanted to ask you about what your commentary is. I mean, you're a very well-known speculative fiction writer. And I think in a lot of ways, conversations about looking to the future, but a lot of this is a conversation that's happening right now. And so I wondered what your intentions are with this story, and whether you think it is a vision for the future, or whether it's actually a commentary on right now?
Well, I believe that all speculative fiction is a commentary on the time you live in, because I don't think you can write about this time now during it, because by the time I finish this sentence, the time which I started the sentence is already gone. It's done. And if you think about the idea of the defund the police, Black Lives Matter, the idea of abolishing prisons, for the most part in our current society, these statements are made by people who are disproportionately imprisoned. It is not the wealthy white people as a rule. And so, yes, there are white people who are a part of the Black Lives Matter movement and the abolition of prisons and defund the police movements. But it's not, for the most part, people of privilege who are fighting for removal of things like the police, or a rethinking of how crime is policed. It's people who are mostly people who are disproportionately imprisoned. And I think that's because people who are from a position of privilege don't ever think of themselves as being the person who ends up in prison. They think of prison or being arrested for crime as something that happens to other people. And even if it does happen to privileged people, generally the prison system is classist anyway. There are white-collar prisons and prisons for people who commit kind of blue-collar or working-class crimes. They're divided. They're completely separate types of prisons. And normally someone who commits a white-collar crime is put in minimum security prison, or someone who commits a drug crime is put in a maximum security prison. It is that simple. So it occurs to me that, like often when I'm writing, my thoughts are that people only believe in bad things happening because they believe those bad things are only going to happen to other people. And I don't think people imagine what if those bad things happen to me. So I like to make people question what would happen how they would feel if it happens to them. That's basically for 2 novels and a bunch of short stories. My main thing I've been looking at is how would you feel if it was you and not me going through this experience? And I haven't been to prison, but I have had family in prison. So,
yeah.
I want to talk to you both about more broadly now the form of speculative fiction. I'll stay on Claire for a moment. But Claire, there are 4 Indigenous contributors in After Australia, including yourself. In addition to yourself, there's Amberlyn Quaimulana, Karen Wilde, and Hannah Donnelly. And speculative fiction is an incredible part of Indigenous literature in this country. You think about writers like Ellen Van Neerven and Alexis Wright. In your own case, in addition to this story, probably the largest contributions to speculative fiction that you've made are your 2 novels, which I strongly encourage our audience to read, Terra Nullius and The Old Lie. I'm curious, why do you think speculative fiction is such a it's such a recognizable genre for Indigenous writers to work in?
Sure. I think part of the power of speculative fiction is the ability to do 2 things: look forward and imagine a better time for people, and a lot of other speculative fiction writers do that. They kind of imagine how the world can improve from this point. But also, I think the power of speculative fiction is the ability to build an entire didactic world. All fiction involves world building. I don't believe that realist fiction is immune from world building. I think that people who write contemporary realism also have to do world building, because they have to kind of build micro worlds within the real world. But speculative fiction, the world building is on a grander scale, and that enables someone to come up with a world in which to tell a story that needs to be told. And speculative fiction is used a lot by Indigenous people in particular to tell things, to say things that are not listened to if you tell them any other way. Rod Serling, who created the TV show The Twilight Zone, said once in an interview that the reason he makes what he called fantastical stories is because what he had to say wouldn't be listened to if he said it was real. And that's where I think we're coming from. We know that no one wants to listen to what we have to say. Australia cannot listen to what we have to say and remain unchanged. And they don't want to change. So if Australia really listened to Aboriginal people, Australia would change. for the better, in my opinion, but it will change. And Australia doesn't want to change. They don't listen. And the way to make them listen is to put it in speculative fiction.
Omar,
Yeah.
so after Australia was developed by Sweatshop in partnership with Diversity Arts Australia, who originally conceived the idea under the direction of our dear friend Lina Nahnus. And we also produced it, of course, in partnership with the publisher, Affirm Press. Now, when Affirm Press read your short story, they offered you a deal, which you took to develop the story into a novel. And, you know, you're most famous, you're most well known as a poet. So this is a significant transition for you. I'm curious, what is it about the speculative fiction form that you think spoke to you so well that you were able to take such a huge transition into this particular style of writing? And now you've shown such a talent for it that you're in the midst of writing a novel in this form.
Well, I think actually it's tied into what Claire was saying there, which is that people of color, as well as Indigenous writers, have long been writing genre fiction, science fiction, fantasy fiction, whatever, and horror, because it was easier to get published in that form than it was to get published as a literary author, for example. So even before we get to whether we're being listened to or not, whether we're being heard or not, there was still that initial barrier, because science fiction, historically less so now, was so easily dismissed. And I've grown up loving fantasy and science fiction. You know, it's what I read predominantly. It's what I've always wanted to write. And I still want to write it. You know, the poetry thing took me by surprise. You know, the discovery that I was a poet and that this is a form that I could be successful in, be heard through. It's beautiful, and I'll treasure it forever. But I am also very excited to move into genre. As to why I've been successful with this particular story, I don't think it has anything to do with the speculative elements so much as it has to do with the fact that because I'm a poet, and I've been a poet for these past few years, I'm just a better writer now. And I am bringing my world to the page. I'm bringing my family to the page, and the queer Arab Muslim experience, as well as even just the Arab Muslim experience in Australia, just has not been well covered.
Let's stay on that for a moment. So the big conversation that everyone's having around your story at the moment is about the white flu, but I really think that's probably the least interesting part of your story. I think that it's the background, and what's far more compelling is the foreground, which you've already touched on a couple of times, but I would love for you to elaborate. I want you to talk to us about the characters in this story, and specifically the Arab, Australian, Muslim, queer identity as it plays out in the story, and how it relates to your own experiences and your own identity.
Yeah, that's a big question. The story is about a bisexual Arab Muslim, very much like myself, whose name is Jamal. And his mother is sick, his estranged mother is ill, and this is the story that is playing out in the foreground while the pandemic is in the background. And so he's trying to reconnect with his estranged family, basically. And yeah, I think this is very much something that I've lived. I keep a distance from my family because this is the way in which I can live my most honest life while trying to maintain a connection to my family. You know, it's just not as simple for someone who comes from a ethnic community, a lot of low socioeconomic background. I've seen this play out in my friends' families as well. We can't just come out and be kicked out and go live a fabulous life. Our community, our families often rely on us economically. They don't have super, they don't have white collar jobs where they can retire. That's not it. They're doing cash in hand jobs a lot of the time. They're doing hard labor that has an incredible toll on their bodies. So their kids are their retirement plan. And there is such a strong cultural obligation to take care of your elders, your family. You can't just leave them behind. And so many of us are stuck in this in-between place of trying to, have the life that we want while also not being able to, be as honest as we would want to with our family members because they're poor, uneducated, and are strictly religious. And this is not true for everyone. Sometimes, particularly class often plays a part in our community. So I know that it's, there are definitely examples out there of people who came out to their families and subsequently found some kind of acceptance. But yeah, I was speaking to kind of what I've lived.
Claire, I want to follow the thread that Omar's been discussing. And in so many ways, me and Omar think of you as our sister, as our blood. We identify as being from minorities, and we are fighting the same, in many ways, a similar struggle. Of course, you identify as Indigenous. We identify as Arab Muslim. But there are other ways that we identify. In Omar's case, talking about things like class and sexuality, I do know resonate with you. And I wondered about how those aspects of your identity intersect with your indigeneity and result in the kind of work you're creating.
Sure. It's interesting. I'm not talking about queerness and class, because queer as we think of it, the Mardi Gras, Pride marches, the coming out, queer books, queer film, is predominantly middle class. Queerness as an experience for most people is a middle class thing. We think of the queer movement as mostly middle class people, most of them who come out as queer, young in life, are university educated or at university when it happens, and mostly middle class and generally have enough money to have the luxurious class lifestyle. You think about even queers on TV, the acceptable vision of queer on TV, you think of things like Will and Grace. He is an upper-class gay lawyer. He's not some gay guy struggling in the streets to live after being kicked out from home. But in reality, the queer experience has a lot of working-class people of colour involved in the queer experience as much as anyone else, but aren't acknowledged as existing. The classic one is, of course, queer Aboriginal people. There are as many queer Aboriginal people as proportion of population as there are queer white people. Maybe possibly more in my experience, because almost everybody I know in Melbourne is queer. Not everyone, but a disproportionate number of people of Melbourne Aboriginal activists are queer. It's just the fact. And when you think about that, I was once doing a panel, and somebody said, because there's in my novel. My second novel, The Old Lie, there's a queer Aboriginal woman, and I was asked by a question from the audience about are queer Aboriginal women common, and I said as a joke, I can't think of any straight Aboriginal women that I knew, and then a friend of mine piped up from the audience and said, "I am," like she's the only one that I actually know. And of course, it was a joke, but the fact of the matter is, not only is queer identities, gay, bi, trans, lesbian, all extremely common in Aboriginal communities, but also accepted by Aboriginal communities. In but most Australians don't know, but in Palm Island and in the Tiwi Islands, both of them remote communities of Aboriginal people living in third world conditions, have strong cultured communities of trans people, trans women particularly. In the Pitjantjatjara lands in northern South Australia, coming out of there's a singer, Zachariah Fielding from the band Electric Fields, who is an out gay man who grew up in a remote community, and he's frankly fabulous. So it's more common than people think, and yet there's a very strong movement to erase Aboriginal queerness.
It's been such an incredible conversation. I feel like we could easily go for another hour, but we are running out of time. I did promise myself I was going to ask you both one final question to wrap up our conversation. As you both know, I didn't include an introduction in After Australia. I really wanted the writing and the writers to speak for themselves, but I did include an epigraph. It's a quote that really meant a lot to me and that I felt spoke to the essence of the book. And the quote is from an important African-American civil rights leader named Malcolm X. I am in his presence. And the quote is that the future belongs to those who prepare for it today. And I wanted to ask you both as a final question, how do you as writers prepare for the future?
I prepare for the future by writing. It's my strong and considered opinion that stories define who we are. What we consider who we are is defined by the stories we are told and the stories we tell ourselves. So by changing the narrative, we can change the future. We can certainly change how people face the future. So I prepare for the future by attempting to modify the future by changing the way people think, by doing the right thing that I was going to do anyway. So if you like, every minute of every day I am preparing for the future.
Thank you, Claire. And Omar?
I don't. I really think that I'm just focused on trying to survive my past. And I don't really have room left over to adequately prepare for the future, and I don't have the resources for it. I do agree with Claire, and I share the sentiment that I hope that my work prepares the way for others, for other Arabs and other Muslims and other queers, to come together. I really do hope that my work can act as a summoning of community. And in that way, there is preparedness for whatever is coming. I've just remembered, though, earlier I said something that I think people might just run away with crazily if I don't go back to it, which is that I did desire an eradication of whiteness. I feel like just quickly, I should maybe go back to that and say, look, when I say that, I don't mean and the end of so-called white people. I'm talking about whiteness as an ideology and a political reality that is used to suppress us, oppress us, displace us, dispossess and destroy us. Us being, for the most part, Indigenous people and people of color. So whiteness as a system, as a way of being, is something that I absolutely want to destroy. And in the sense that I would hope that anybody who is in this moment being identified as white would actively assist us in dismantling this system, so that we can all get away from how we are racialized and move forward toward an equal future.
Thanks, Omar. I think we should also ask Claire to speak to that if you wanted to talk about the difference between whiteness and being white.
Yeah. Actually, that's an interesting topic because whiteness is, as we think of it, as a white as a race doesn't exist. Until the birth of race theory in the 17th century, the idea of race was, the race theory, the difference between whiteness and blackness, separating white from black. The racism was actually, for example, the English versus the French. Whiteness, as we know it, is actually was founded on the concept of white supremacy. So whiteness, the idea of a white race, did not exist before white supremacy. They did not consider themselves to be one white people until they wanted to draw a line between themselves and everyone else. So they defined this idea of whiteness as a way to define who is superior. Before that, there was no such thing. So I think whiteness as a philosophy needs to be dismantled because whiteness and white supremacy are so strongly entwined that we cannot actually have we cannot dismantle white supremacy without dismantling the definition of whiteness.
Thank you both. I prepare for the future by reading your work and being inspired and educated by the both of you. And I'm always deeply moved by the critical discussions that we have across these incredibly complex issues. I am Michael Mohammed Ahmad, and I have been joined today by Claire G. Coleman, author of Terra Nullius and the Old Lie, and Omar J. Sakr, author of These Wild Houses and The Lost Arabs. I am the editor of the brand new anthology After Australia, and both Claire and Omar have incredible contributions in this anthology. And I urge anybody that's joined us in this discussion to check out not just After Australia, but the amazing books by these two incredible writers. I want to finish by saying Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you in the language of my ancestors. And again, I want to thank Claire and Omar for joining me in this amazing discussion.
Borawan, which in the language of my ancestors means until next time, essentially.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I want to just quickly shout out your incredible job, the incredible job that you have done as an editor of this anthology, and also encourage people to read your work, read the Lebs, read the Tribe. And thank you for facilitating this conversation. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.